being hailed as one of the biggest game changers in a long time for American public health and for how we treat infections. And it was discovered right here in Boston. Researchers at Northeastern University have found a new antibiotic, the first new class of antibiotics discovered in nearly 30 years. And the biggest news, they say, is that it appears to effectively treat the growing number of superbugs we've been seeing lately, like MRSA.
We found something that hasn't been seen before, an antibiotic that is largely free of resistance. Because, you see, there's a dogma in my field that bacteria will always develop resistance. So I looked at the facts and I realized that nature evolved a compound that is seriously protected from resistance development. That was the driving force behind the evolution of teixobactin.
Professor Kim Lewis and his team, in fact, grew their new antibiotic, teixobactin, in soil. So why is this discovery getting so much attention? WGBH News science editor Heather Goldstone joins me with more on that. Hey, Heather.
Good to be here.
So why is this discovery such a big deal?
Well, we tend to think of antibiotics as being kind of a basic part of healthcare, right? Probably everybody's been on antibiotics, but in fact, they only came into general use in the 40s, maybe 50s, and they were huge game changers because there were all of these infections that had been killers, major killers, that we could suddenly control. And the problem is that in recent years, we've seen a rise in these drug-resistant bacterial infections that have prompted some people to say we could actually be looking at a post-antibiotic way of life where antibiotics no longer do their job.
Which is totally terrifying. Anytime I read an article about this, I have to stop about halfway through because I'm so frightened.
It is. It's completely frightening.
Why has there been this rise in drug-resistant bacteria?
Well, part of it is because we didn't expect it, right? So antibiotics are natural products. There are all sorts of different microbes in the world and different animals in the world that are making these kind of products to ward off infections, to ward off competitors. And we brought them into this realm of healthcare and then started using them pretty much willy-nilly. And in addition, then early on, the agricultural sector figured out that they could make animals grow faster if they gave small doses of antibiotics. And so there was this huge use of them.
So they actually don't use antibiotics to protect animals against infections? It's
not always. A large part of the use is this, maybe not even prophylactic, just using it at a very chronic low level as essentially a growth factor. And so there was this huge amount of antibiotics suddenly in the world, and it just prompted leaps in evolution where all these other microbes that are pathogens started evolving ways to resist it.
Okay, so I know teixobactin, did I get that right? Teixobactin,
yes.
Teixobactrin. It is created using something called an iChip, which sounds very fancy, but you were telling me a moment ago it's actually not that complicated, right? How does an iChip work?
No computers or anything. So basically what it is, and I think we have some footage of it, is it's this plastic contraption that has a whole lot of really tiny holes in it, and you can see those there. And what they do is they take an extract of soil and dilute it down so that in each one of those holes you basically get one cell. And then they smack these, what they call semi-permeable membranes on either side of it that will let chemicals in and out, but won't let the bacteria out or other bacteria in. And then they put it back in the soil and they use that to actually grow the bacteria.
So why do they need to do this culturing in the soil? Why not do it in the lab?
Well, because in the lab, a lot of these bacteria are actually really hard to grow. What most researchers are working with, whether it's soil or the human gut or the deep ocean, maybe 1%, probably less, of the bacteria that are in nature that we can grow in the lab. And so that really limits what we can look at to try to find these natural products, whether it's antibiotics or other drugs. And so this is a really great way to say, okay, well, we've got them in kind of a semi-controlled environment, but we can put them back out there into the natural environment where they get all the nutrients and other chemical signals that they need to grow well, that we don't really understand well enough to reproduce in the lab.
So it sounds to me then like this is a conceptual shift that could lead to the discovery of a whole lot more beneficial antibiotics, right?
Right,
Not
absolutely.
Just
I mean, the methodology is as exciting as this one drug. And they say they found about 25 other potentials, many of which didn't turn out to be as promising as this. But yeah, it opens up a new way of looking through a huge library of bacteria and the chemicals that they make. And it could even be really interesting for other areas of science besides trying to look for antibiotics, because it opens up the whole world of looking at microbial ecology in a different way.
Have big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Merck, and others, have they been working on this problem as well?
Not as much as a lot of people would like to see, although I think that's starting to shift. So there's been a really slow trickle of new antibiotics. FDA approving maybe 5 or 6 or just 1 or 2 in a year. But We have seen in the past couple of years the development of one new antibiotic that Merck is now buying, a small startup actually right here in the Boston area that developed a new antibiotic. This is actually a startup that was a spin-off from Northeastern University. And actually last year, President Obama announced kind of new initiative for both ways to monitor drug-resistant infections and also trying to push more financial incentives for the pharmaceutical industry to get into this.
Now, Teixobactin is not a silver bullet, right? There's some things it can't do?
No, absolutely. So while it seems to be hard for microbes to develop resistance to it, and it does treat things like MRSA and some other really important drug-resistant tuberculosis, it seems to work at least in mice, right? This hasn't been tested in humans. But it only treats about half of bacteria or one class of bacteria that have a certain kind of cell wall. So it doesn't treat others. And there is still the potential that it could, over time, it would probably take a while, but the bacteria could develop resistance to this.
Okay, and it doesn't treat things like cholera, right? I read.
Right, that's it.
Also.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the sexually transmitted infections are in the class of bacteria that this won't work against.
And briefly, how soon might Teixobactin be on the market?
They're saying 5-ish years, probably a couple more years of lab tests, a couple years of clinical trials. So that's the hope, is about 5 years. And it would not be something that you'd be taking orally. It would have to be an injection still, they're projecting.
All right, Heather Goldstone, thank you. You just took down my generalized anxiety level a tiny little bit. Appreciate it.